Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 6th in the National Archives online lecture series for 2021. My name is Elizabeth McAvoy, and I'm the archivist with responsibility for education and outreach in the National Archives. And on behalf of the office, we're delighted to welcome you here tonight, and also to welcome our three guest speakers, Zoë Reid, Dr. Peter Crooks, and Dr. Ciarán Wallace, who will present on recovering the lost collections of the Public Record Office of Ireland. Before we begin, I'd like to go through just a few housekeeping details so that you can engage with our event. Audience cameras are off and mics are on mute, but we encourage your active participation in tonight's talk using the webinar's Q&A function. Tonight's talk will run roughly for about 50 minutes with 10 minutes for Q&A at the end, give or take. You'll have the opportunity to submit your questions during the talk, so please type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of the control panel, as the chat box is not operating for this talk. We'll accommodate as many questions as time permits, so apologies in advance if we don't get around to answering yours. We're recording this webinar and we'll make it available on our website, www.nationalarchives.ie, shortly, as we've already done with all our previous online evening lectures since last February. So do check out our website or our Twitter page at NAR Ireland for the link to the recording. We'll also be live tweeting this talk, so please like and retweet our posts too. So a few words about this evening's talk. In 1922, the Public Record Office of Ireland was destroyed in the opening engagement of the Civil War, and the tragedy and drama of its destruction has created some legends which have obscured the real story of our Public Record Office. In its short but successful lifetime, the Public Record Office established itself at the heart of Irish historical and genealogical research, and the story of its purpose-built, fireproof record treasury, the staff who built up the collections, and the people who used its services all remain to be told. Myths have arisen about exactly what was in the building and what was lost in June and July 1922. And exciting work has been underway for a number of years to recover and conserve material from the catastrophic fire and explosion. In this lecture, Zoë Reid, Senior Conservator at the National Archives, along with Dr. Peter Crooks and Dr. Ciarán Wallace of the Beyond 2022 project, will tell us the fascinating story of the life and death of the Public Record Office and its remarkable digital rebirth. So a few words about our presenters today. If Ciarán, Zoë, and Peter can just switch back on their cameras, please. Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. Thank you. So about our speakers, Dr. Peter Crooks is Associate Professor in Medieval History in the Department of History in Trinity College Dublin, and is the founding director of Beyond 2022, Ireland's virtual record treasury. The Beyond 2022 project is an all-Ireland and international collaboration to create a virtual reconstruction of the Public Record Office of Ireland and its collections, which were destroyed at the outbreak of the Civil War. Peter was also the academic coordinator of the Trinity Long Room Hub's multi-annual lecture series entitled Out of the Ashes, Collective Memory, Cultural Loss and Recovery, which was immensely successful and ran from 2018 to earlier this year. Next up is Dr. Ciarán Wallace, Deputy Director of Beyond 2022. Ciarán has lectured in modern Irish history at Trinity College, Dublin City University, and John Moores University, Liverpool, and has been involved in designing online teaching modules and digital history projects. Ciarán is the convener of the Dublin History Research Network, and he joined the Beyond 2022 project in its startup phase. Meanwhile, Zoë Reid, who trained in paper conservation at the Camberwell College of Art in London, has been the Senior Conservator in the National Archives since 2002. Zoë established the Conservation Department, which is responsible for safeguarding the long-term preservation of the national collection and ensuring safe public access to the archives. She is an accredited conservator, guest lecturer on the Masters in Archival Studies taught at UCD, and has been a member of the Beyond 2022 project since its inception. I now hand over to Ciarán, Zoe, and Peter to discuss Malignant Destiny, recovering the lost collections of the Public Record Office of Ireland. Over to you, Ciarán. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth, and good evening, everyone. Let me just share my screen so we can get started. A malignant destiny seems to have followed the preservation of the Irish public records for centuries. That's a sentence spoken by Herbert Wood, who was the deputy keeper or the boss of the Public Record Office of Ireland about a month after the destruction of the archive that was his life's work. And he was talking not just about the destruction of 1922, catastrophic as that was, he was talking about the earlier centuries of Irish archival history, which was a long litany of major and minor disasters and destructions. And we can forgive, I think, Herbert Wood standing in the ruins of his own archive, being so pessimistic about things. But actually, I think our project with our colleagues, our project on Beyond 2022 with our colleagues in the National Archives Ireland and a range of archives and repositories around the country and around the world, I think is perhaps being, I think it's a little more positive. There's a slightly optimistic question mark in our title there. And Beyond 2022 is about optimism, it's about rebuilding. So let's go back into the deeper history. What was this centuries of malignant destiny that Woods was talking about? So Ireland's record collection, Ireland's archival history was a litany of risky repositories and problems arising therefrom. Records, the state records, so these are the records of all the courts, all the criminal justice, the taxation records, lands, wills, all those sort of state level records tended to be kept in very unsuitable premises. So they could be kept in the attic of the office where the office took place. So the attic might have a hole in the roof and rain got in. They could be kept in the basement where rats and mice could eat away at these animal skin parchment rolls. They could be kept in buildings that were prone to fire. I mean, going back as far as in the central image there, St. Mary's Abbey in Dublin. So this is a medieval abbey around the time of the Norman invasion, or 100 years after. Important records were lost in a fire at the abbey around Capel Street area in 1345. So even back that far, there was fires of archival records. Records were kept for security in the Custom House Dublin, which was then in the early 18th century on the site of what's now the Clarence Hotel, the middle photograph. And that too went on fire in 1711. Important records were lost there. There was also a fire in the Record Tower in Dublin Castle and various other locations, family homes where records were kept. Another surprising sort of strand of risk to Irish records was the habit of senior English governors coming to Ireland, working away here for 5 or 10 years as the Lord Lieutenant or the Chief Secretary, and then as they left to go home to their estates in England, taking their public records with them. So they actually carried away official records as their private bag and baggage. So the next person coming in had to try and run the country without the previous year's accounts and records and so forth. So hugely problematic. The problem was well recognised, and by the early 19th century, the government in London had set up the Irish Record Commission. So this was a set of commissioners, a set of scholars who were going to track down and find every important Irish historical document. They were going to transcribe it longhand and prepare it for printing. And once they were printed, like, if you like, it's like a backup print copy. Once you'd printed a few thousand copies of these things and put them out there in the world, if the original was lost, that's not a huge problem because you have print copies available. The record commissioners were an expensive and egotistical bunch of men, and they were all men, and they were closed down as kind of as a bad job in 1830. It took them 20 years to discover they were a bad job. They had lots of stuff written up, but not much had been printed, and lots of infighting. So I mentioned those just to park that name, Irish Record Commissioners, in your head. You'll hear about them later in this evening's presentations. By the late 19th century, so that's the early 19th century, by the late 19th century, the situation was looking better. We had a new Public Record Ireland Act by 1867 and the Public Record Office of Ireland. So an act and a building came together. This is about 30 years-ish after there was a London Record Office and an act for England. The Record Treasury, the Public Record Office, the actual premises, was, they used the building which had been built by the law courts in the Four Courts to hold their legal records. And it was then, before it even was brought into use, it was actually taken over by the state and used for all the state records. And it was situated in the Four Courts complex. You can see here a map of the Four Courts. The River Liffey is at the bottom of the image. And they pushed back the tighter boundary of the Four Courts, the railings, taking over some small alleys and streets. And in the top left-hand corner, the northwest corner of the site, they built the Record Office. And that's what's today the junction of more or less Church Street and the Lewis line at the Broadstone, just at the back of the Four Courts. And you can see here this sort of enlargement. I'll blow up the, well, I shouldn't say blow up the image, but this enlargement of the image. You can see the front, the building is in two parts. There's a square section to the front, which is the record house. This is the administrative block. This is where you have the staff and the public go in to read the records. It's where you have open coal fires, gas lights, people smoking pipes and tobacco and whatnot. So that's a place of risk for fire. Then the long, narrow building at the back is the Record Treasury, and they did call it the Treasury. That's how they regarded the records. And it is a building which is separate, is housed separately. If there was a fire in the front block, this fire gap in the center would prevent the fire spreading to the rear building, which is the main, long, narrow, tall warehouse building, the Record Treasury. And they're joined by a narrow neck of a building, which was like a metal walkway that could be pulled down rapidly in the event of a fire. They knew that fires very often happened in archives, so they were preparing against the fateful day. So here you see the building in a photograph taken around 1914-15, and this the building that you see here, the front office is where the, as I say, all the fire risk was, but the rear office had these tall glass windows, long glass roof, lots of natural light. All the fittings were metal, all the shelving, walkways, stairs were metal. Wherever they had to use wood, they used fire-resistant timber. Even the cardboard boxes in which the records were kept, they used impregnated cardboard to try and reduce the risk of fire. So the whole purpose was to make it fireproof. The Public Record Act was the great tool they had to use to fill this building. The Act meant that the deputy keeper, this is the person in charge of the record office, had the legal authority to go out to all the different record collections around the country, around the city, and any records over 20 years of age, he could bring them into his office, into his record treasury. And they brought them in very, they came in different levels of disarray or decomposition nearly, but they would put manners on them and they put order on them and do what archivists do, and make them into a searchable, usable thing. You can see here what looks like one solid wall isn't. This is the fire break. You can see the two different roof heights, and behind this is just like a false wall. It's like a stage wall. Behind it is the void. This is the fire break void that's going to save, or was intended to save, the rear part of the building, and this is all inside the Four Courts complex. So who would work in a place like this? So we have these cartoons of staff working in the record office from the earlier decades of its existence, the 1870s and 80s. And on the right-hand side, you'll see Samuel Ferguson. He is the first deputy keeper, the first boss of the organization. The deputy keeper, the word deputy sounds like he's second in command. The actual keeper was a senior law judge who didn't actually do any archival work. He was just nominally the head of the organization. The actual chief operations officer was the deputy keeper, in this case, Samuel Ferguson, who held the first post. He was accompanied in the job by John T. Gilbert, who was his second in command. Gilbert had always wanted the job of being keeper of the new record office, but he was seen by the state as being a spiky personality and was better to give it to somebody else. So they invented a second in command role for him. Lots of other staff, senior clerks who were sort of scribes, linguists, historians, that sort of people, and then writing clerks who were just literally transcribers. In a time before typewriters, all writing was done by hand, so you need copyists, that's who they were. And then you had searchers who searched out records and fetched them down to the readers in the reading room, and then you had the labourers who kept the place going and the housekeeping staff. So here you have, what's nice about this cartoon collection is we have, for instance, Alfred Poulter and Richard Tucker at the bottom. Both of these men had their families living in the complex. The Tuckers lived in the record office itself, in the flat on the top floor, and they were multi-generational occupants of that flat. And the Poulters lived in a flat, we believe, in the Four Courts complex. They, as you see here, Alfred Poulter is dressed up like a butler or a waiter. The families, descendants of both these men, have been in touch with us, and we're in contact with them, so we get some sense of what happened to these staff, what happened to their families in later years after their involvement with the record office. Richard Tucker has a saw in his hand because he was a workman, like a workman foreman on the site. When we come a bit further forward into the 20th century, you can see some of the searchers, and this sounds like a 1950s beat combo, but actually the searchers is what they were called. They actually went and searched for records and brought them to inquirers and researchers down in the search room. And here you see J.J. Tucker and his son, J.J. Tucker Jr. So there's 3 generations of Tuckers, and we know some of the stories around these other people in the on the staff, including Victor George Judge, who is the boy learner. So he's the trainee, the apprentice, if you like. There were some women working in the record office, but in a very sort of fragmentary way. The wives of Tuckers and Poulters would have worked as housekeepers and cleaners in the premises. By 1913, around the time this photograph was taken, they had what they called a lady sewer, and this was an expert woman who did repairs to bookbinding and so forth. So a lot of these ancient books needed to be reconstructed and bound again. So they fought very hard to get a permanent woman on the staff, and the Treasury did not want a permanent woman on the staff, but they worked very hard to get her on the staff. I don't think she was paid the same rate as everybody else, but there was a woman on the staff there. Amongst the people working in the Record Treasury, the one most important for our project is Herbert Wood. He was the deputy keeper. He was a lifelong career worker in the Record Office, and he reached the top of the tree by 1921. So he was the deputy keeper in charge of the whole operation. And Herbert Wood and his colleagues have been involved in that sort of really laborious but invisible work of putting order on chaos, making a haystack of loose records into something that's findable. There's indexes, catalogs, finding aids, calendars, are these sort of brief summaries of documents, so that when you go into the reading room, you can look through a sort of a finding aid like a directory, identify the record you want, and the searcher will bring you out that one record, rather than having you go in and rummage around shelves, or rather than giving you 10 volumes and say, find the reference to Sligo that you want. A finding aid allows you to go straight to the page and open it on Sligo if that's what you're interested in researching. But Herbert Wood's great contribution, amongst many writings that he did, was his guide to the records. And his guide to the records was the nearest thing that the Record Office ever had to a catalogue. It never had one centralized catalogue as we think of it today. The guide didn't list every single record, it listed all the major collections. So to tell you, we have got sheriff's records from the 1700s in Galway, we have taxation records from New Ross from the Tudor times, we've got land records from County Antrim. So it described all the major collections in about 350 pages. And it's described sometimes as the saddest book in Irish history because it's published in 1919. We now know that everything in that was destroyed more or less by 1922, only 3 years later, but we can list in sort of exquisite detail the stuff that didn't make it out, that didn't survive, what we could have seen. But this is what we're working to try and replace. So inside the building, if you went into the search room itself as a researcher, as a customer, if you like, you go into the counter, you'd speak to the archivists across the counter here. On the far right is Herbert Wood himself and his colleague D.A. Chart. They would help you fill in your form, find out what records you want. The searcher would go through the doorway at the back, out through the passageway, to the fire break, into the rear building, fetch your records and bring them down to you, and you'd sit on the far side of the record of the search room there over here, and you'd read your records in sort of this top lit room, and this is where you have the gas lamps and that risk of fire I mentioned. If you went through into the back room, if you're one of the searchers, this is the premises that they worked in. So it's quite a remarkable premises, purpose-built, as Elizabeth was saying. It is 6 stories of metal and framework and so forth over a stone floor and stone basement, huge glass ceiling on top. Sometimes people think it looks like a prison, not unreasonable because of the amount of metalwork, but the metalwork is for fire avoidance. And here you see the searchers at work. They don't bring lights into those sort of darkened book stacks. They bring the records out into the atrium where the daylight is, and they consult them and bring you down the records that you want. So here you get an idea of them working away, using all those finding aids and all those equipment that the archivists had designed to make the records into something sensible, turning it from a haystack into an actual working archive. Every year they produced an annual report, and most years in the early period they produced this schematic. So this is like a cross-section or a vertical map of the 6 stories. So you can imagine there are 6 floors of records stacked up this way, and maybe about 60 bays or 60 about a dozen shelving units along each floor. So here you can see, you know, the ground floor is floor 1, floor 2, and so on up to floor 6, and it tells you at a very general level what's stored in each bay. And in this case here, we're seeing in the top right-hand floor here, floor 6, Bay I and Bay K. So these are the furthest away from the entrance door. We can see the census from the 1820s and through to the 1850s. So we know where the 19th century census records were stored when they burnt in 1922. So it is kind of heartbreaking in one way, but it's extremely useful for our research to know what was in the building and therefore what wasn't, where it was shelved, and to get some sense of how they operated, how the building was conceived of, and how the archivists themselves worked with it. So having created this wonderful collection of records and this wonderful searchable thing, unexpectedly, the Public Record Office became perhaps the most popular state agency in Ireland in 1909 when the Old Age Pension Act was introduced across Britain and Ireland. And this was a non-contributory pension, means tested, to people who were means qualified to get it over 70 years of age. And in Ireland, there were 250,000 or more applicants for the pension. But the difficulty was to prove that you were over 70 years of age in 1909, you had to have a birth cert or some proof of birth from before the 1830s or 1840s, before the period when there was a statutory registration of births. So you'd have to have a church certificate or baptism certificate, something like that. And in many cases, this wasn't possible. If you're Church of Ireland, much more likely that you would have a record, because the Church of Ireland was the established church and a Department of State, if you like. For the Catholic Church and the other non-conformist Protestant churches, records were very hit and miss, very hard to prove that you were 70 years of age. The way you could do is by writing to the Record Office and saying, please find my family in the census from 1841 or 1851, verify my name and date and age, and then write that back to me in an official search, and that allows me to get the pension. So there was suddenly a very real need for the archive to show its mettle and to show it what it could do. It became so busy doing just this job and nothing else. I think all archival work nearly ceased for about 2 years while they just dealt with the initial sort of avalanche of applications for the census and the pension thing coming in. It's interesting to note that people are writing in that many of these letters, writing in to say, I think I'm about 70 years of age. I expect I'm 72 years of age. People didn't know their own age because why would you? But nowadays we're very concerned with knowing exactly our age, but then they're sort of giving a rough estimation. While the census records were all destroyed, or almost practically all destroyed from the 19th century, these letters of application survived because they were in the front building. And the National Archives has put them on a search-based database that you can search on the website. So if you're lucky enough that one of your ancestors was amongst this group and somebody wrote in on their behalf, you might find a letter or something where they claim to be from some townland on some date and certain parents. So it gives you a window back into that set of records. But bigger challenges arose. So the 1916 Rising, the Record Office and the forecourts was occupied as part of the general collection of buildings that were occupied in the city centre. There was rifle fire and fighting going on all around the forecourts complex and all around the Record Office itself. The rebels used volumes and bags as sandbags as sort of security against the windows, lots of windows to cover up in the Record Treasury itself and in the Record Office. When the Rising was finished and the rebels had surrendered and the archivists were allowed back in, it was a great tribute to their good housekeeping that they were able to find what was misshelved and what was missing and what was kicked around the floor, identify it, reshelve everything, and so much so that by the following year's annual report, the deputy keeper was able to say one single document, and they could identify the one single document, had gone missing, and this was a soldier's will from the 1850s. So only one document was completely gone and no copy existed and they couldn't replace it. So I think by that stage, it's a real proof if they can survive that, they can survive anything, or so you would think. Only minor damage done and a fairly quick recovery from 1916. A much bigger challenge, though, was the Great War. While the Great War didn't come to Dublin in that sense, other than 1916 being a front of the Great War in one argument, but the Great War took a lot of staff away from the Record Office, a lot of resources away from the Record Office. Census records were pulped for paper. The office itself was running out of money. They couldn't hire new staff. And 4 long years of very sort of tedious, just holding on by their fingernails to keep it going. At the end of the Great War, comes the War of Independence. The Record Office got through that quite easily, no real problems during the 1919 to 21-22 period, followed by the treaty and then the truce. Sorry, the truce and then the treaty, and then the treaty is what obviously leads then to the Civil War. And here we have the anti-treaty forces occupying the forecourts complex in Easter 1922. What they're doing is the anti-treaty forces who are opposing the Anglo-Irish Treaty, they're recreating or reenacting, if you like, the 1916 Rising. So they're occupying a building that was occupied in 1916. They're doing it on Easter weekend. So they occupy it on Holy Thursday onto Good Friday. They dismiss all the families that live there and they take over all the buildings that long weekend, and then they sit tight. They barricade the gates and doors and windows and they sit tight. It doesn't become a shooting war straight away. There's 8 long weeks of kind of a standoff. And during that time, life goes on around the city. People go on around the local streets. Nothing much happens until the actual fighting begins at the end of June. During that period, during that 8-week period, this is what Ernie O'Malley, in his famous book, The Singing Flame, he describes sort of the mood inside this encampment as what effectively a military camp. The anti-treaty forces had called what we know as the Record Treasury. They dubbed it the munitions block because it's where they use that wonderful daylight coming in through the roof and the ceiling and the walls. They used all that daylight to make the fiddly work of making munitions. So O'Malley describes the jumble of lathes and molds and hand grenades on the shelves amongst the records, electric wires, explosives, and in the lower rooms, a large amount of TNT. So this was, they were using this as an actual arms manufactory, and they'd occupied the entire complex, but they were using the daylight in that building for that purpose. This photograph is taken from the Daily Mirror English newspaper had an aircraft up in the sky taking a photograph. So long was the sort of the standoff going on, they could commission an aircraft and take a photograph of it. But that's the last photograph. Indeed, it's the only aerial photograph taken of the Record Treasury, and you can see its tall windows here. I won't go into the details of why the thing devolved into the actual shooting match of the Civil War by the 28th of June, but by the 28th to the 30th of June, the National Army troops outside have now opened fire, given an ultimatum, and opened fire on the anti-treaty forces inside the forecourts. Fighting goes on for 2 days. By the third day, the forecourts complex is ablaze. The battle is nearly over, and at that period in time is when you see this kind of scene here. Dublin witnessed this huge explosion, the loudest explosion apparently ever heard in the city, and the place is rocked and this huge pillar of smoke goes up. What you're looking at here is a view from the UCD archives, a view taken, I think, from about Cornmarket. It's on the south side of the river on an elevated position. The river itself is kind of hidden down below in front of the dome of the forecourts. Over here on the far right, you'll see Nelson's Pillar. And this here on the left is the arched windows of the Record Treasury. The roof is gone. The explosion has thrown a huge pillar of smoke up, and all these records have blown out into the city, out into Dublin Bay. And you're looking, in the space of an hour, you're looking at 700 years of Irish history going up in smoke. And that's the great tragedy that we're all sort of still recovering from, if you like. The destruction was really complete. So this is all the bad news. This is why Wood would felt this was such a tragedy, and he would be right. You can see the level of destruction. All the metalwork inside here is all melted. So the shelving and all have buckled in the heat, and they cascaded all the records down into the center atrium of the Record Treasury, where they've all caught fire like a self-feeding furnace, if you like. And it leads us to this point of like utter destruction. What could possibly survive, or so you would think. So this is where I'll hand over to my colleague Zoë Reid and on to Peter to talk about the positive and what can be retrieved. And this last image is the picking up the pieces, and that's, I think, a suitable way to hand over to Zoë. So thanks for listening, and I'll pass over now and stop sharing.
Thanks, Ciarán. That was absolutely fascinating. And as always, you've managed to throw up photographs and images that I've not even seen before. So thanks for that. Right, I'm going to share my screen. Good evening, everybody. Here we go. And fingers crossed, everybody can now do the magic button. And here we go. Okay, so I've no way of knowing, so somebody shout at me if you can, if the screen doesn't show. But I'm going to pick up the story, no pun intended, literally where Ciarán has just left off. So I'm talking about the immediate aftermath, and I'm coming from the history side of things, looking at how the staff recovered from that tragedy and how they went into that rubble very quickly afterwards. We know from documentation, it's limited, but we do know from documentation that support came very quickly to deal with the tragedy of the 30th of June. And it came in the form of the Department of Finance, and the minister at the time of that first oil Department of Finance was obviously Michael Collins. And an order came through down to the OPW to appoint a salvage operations expert. And the man who was appointed was a gentleman called John Chandler Smith. And John Chandler Smith was a structural engineer and came with a high level of expertise because he had previously worked on the damage of the customs house that had happened in the May 1921. You can see from this document that was written later by James Morrissey in 1928 that actually the staff then started to go in and were allowed to go in to the rubble on the 17th of July 1922, and for the best part of a year they continued to work through the rubble. And I suppose as somebody who deals with disaster management and risk for collections, I'm always struck by what it must have been like for the staff going in to the rubble and looking at the collection that they knew so well, that they'd worked with so well, and seeing it literally just amongst concrete and building rubble and dust and debris. But they did that, and they did it with extreme dedication and care, and went in to recover material. And we know from some reports, again, that come from the valuable source of the Deputy Keeper's reports, that they were then assigned rooms in Dublin Castle. And it took me a while to kind of piece that together, but that's where they took the documents they found amongst the rubble, and they took them to Dublin Castle, where they had a room where they could clean them off and identify the archives. And don't forget that these were the archivists and staff who'd worked with the collection, so they had a high level of knowledge of the material that was there. And as best they could, they worked together and they wrapped them up in brown paper parcel, incredibly practical at the time. Brown paper parcel, they secured it with string and they put a label on it. And basically they managed to recover documents from that building rubble that date from the 14th through to the 20th century. And so the parcels were safe and secure, and that kind of work stopped in 1923 of going into the rubble. But I don't think it's fair. We used to sort of say that, and then kind of nothing happened for the next 95 years. And that isn't really fair, because actually, when we start to dig deeper and do more research, we can find actually that there was an awful lot of work went on in between. It goes without saying to say that these were archivists, so they provided lists very clearly of all the salvage materials, and those were published, and we have access to those. And then it's also noted in later deputy keepers' reports, both from 1931 and from 1950, that repair work continued, and they will list the repairs and the volumes, mainly on books, I will say, but they did kind of continue to do work. But I think it's fair to say there was just too much work and too much material to tackle with very scant resources. So then we jump to 2017, and I suppose we're into a heightened awareness of our history and the decade of commemorations. And so one of the projects that came involved, that started, really was, lost my train of thought. Basically, 2017, we got support from the Irish Manuscripts Commission. And without that support, we wouldn't have been able to do a concentrated project whereby we looked at all the parcels that were left, that hadn't been opened, that hadn't been looked at by the staff in the previous 95 years. And we looked at those and we did a concentrated survey on them. We knew that we'd have to be very focused because we could get easily distracted, because we knew we were going to find things that were amazing. So we did a 16-week project with one project conservator and one conservation assistant who was also an excellent photographer, who had photography skills as well. And so we set about in 2017 of doing a very concentrated survey of the parcels as they were. And this is an example of the parcels. And there were, within the National Archives as it is today, there were 378 of those parcels. So the results of the survey, what we did as conservators, because obviously we're looking at not so much the content of what the documents say, but actually their physical content of how they are. And so we devised a numeric grade. So things were either good, they were a grade 1, so they were stable, you could handle them, you could touch them, you could open them up and you could read them, or they were grade 5, they were very, very vulnerable. And as we go through the presentation, you'll get to see some examples of the different levels of documents that were there. Basically, it was that idea of how much access can we get to the text, and that would then define the grades that we gave them. So the contents of the parcels in the 5 grades, and here they are. Essentially, you're looking at roughly 25,000 sheets of parchment and paper were recovered out of that building rubble. So in fairness, I think now we can quite concretely say that not everything was lost. And these numbers here that you see on the screen, the 28 grade 1 stable, those are actually the parcels. Because what happened was when we opened up the parcels, there was either, in some cases, maybe just one document, or else there were bundles of documents that had been grouped together. So it was pretty difficult to quantify. So we kept with the parcel idea at this stage in the project. And so after the survey, because we've been very successful and the Irish Manuscripts Commission were incredibly excited and also incredibly supportive, they provided us with some more funding, and we did another 16-week project where we took the material from the grade 1s, the 28 parcels that were in the best condition, and we said, right, we're going to do a surface clean of those. We're going to get all the dirt and dust off them. And we did that. And here you've got an idea of just the scale of what that means. So within those 28 parcels, there were, nearly 3,000 pages of paper and nearly 1,000 different parchment sheets of various sizes. And so to talk a bit more about the conservation, because obviously that's really why I'm here and what I do. So cleaning away the dirt, just to talk through some of our conservation techniques. We use various techniques to remove that top level of dirt, mainly dirt. There's some soot there, There's not too much building rubble. In fairness, they got most of that off in 1922 and 23. Occasionally, we're finding a tiny little bit of glass, or there's something that's kind of welded to a document. But we use these things called both smoke sponges, and this is a special museum grade eraser as well, that really help just pick up and remove that top layer of dirt, which means you can start to see the text and the writing underneath, and again, providing more access to the information that's there. This is one of the first projects that we did in the sense of looking at the material. And this looks like a little bundle of forms, which is exactly what it is. When we cleaned these, we were able to see what they were. They were Yeomanry Returns from 1798. And these were printed forms with manuscript annotations. And this is what they look like before we kind of opened them up and surface cleaned. But you can see they're in reasonably good condition. You kind of think, huh, really? They came through a fire? And then we progressed further with the conservation. So obviously, to provide access to things, you need to open them up so people can read them. And one of the easiest ways to do that, one of the techniques that we've used extensively throughout the project to date, is the use of a thing called ultrasonic humidification. And that's essentially introducing a water vapor in quite a controlled way to reintroduce moisture both into paper and into parchment. Basically, if you think about the documents that were retrieved from the fire, essentially they'd been baked. And you can see here in that lower image where you see the central scorch marks on the yeomanry forms. That's where the forms were folded, and you can see the scorching coming in just along those central folds. So because these were in relatively good condition, it was a good pathway into kind of what will the conservation treatment be, what will work. And here you can see an example of whereby I'm testing out various tissues, and in the end I go for this very lovely, very light Japanese tissue, which is a lovely tone. The repairs look almost invisible, and that's really important for me as well, because when we're doing conservation repairs to documents, which is to stable them, to make sure they don't get damaged and tear any further or degrade any further. But we need the tissue to be light because we need to be able to see the text underneath it. And so that's incredibly important. But working with a very light tissue like this also is kind of tricky and definitely needs a good bit of skill and practice. And oh, now what's happened? Oh, here we go. Collectors of customs. So this again is another subset. And again, we were able to open up these parcels, and then we started to identify these because they're clearly listed in the Deputy Keeper's reports. And it's like, okay. And we could see, and I suppose I'm a conservator, so I hadn't really read things very carefully. But what I was beginning to see when we opened these parcels was actually I could see a repetition in the format, in the document format, how they were grouped together and the types of documents they were. And I was beginning to see a pattern. So then I went back and started reading up and trying to figure out what things were. These are pretty exciting in terms of their, as you can see the dates here from 1702 all the way through to 1821. But the lovely thing about this is these are tax returns really from customs and port areas, but they go around the country. So it's not just Dublin centric, and that's very important. So there's a range of these. Some of them we have about 3 things perhaps for one district. Another one we have a very large bundle like this, and this is the bundle for Athlone, which has been currently going under conservation and is completed now, which, believe it just looks like a bundle. I can't off the top of my head remember exactly how many documents were there, but believe me, there's a huge amount of work has gone into conserving those, so those documents are all stable and can be listed by the project archivist. To open up those documents and give you an example of what they look like on the inside, this is an example of a return from Dun Laoghaire from 1726. Dun Laoghaire is a small port in County Down, just along the Antrim coast. And here you can see the surface damage that would have been that dirt that we cleaned off from the front, but we can see water damage and staining. And then you start to remember, okay, these documents, once the fire was put out, there obviously was water damage would have come from sort of quelling the fire, and then also water damage because the building was exposed to the elements. And, you know, over the period of 12 months while the staff were going in to recover this stuff, obviously material would have been exposed to rainwater and the winter and everything else. And we can also see high levels of physical damage in terms of tears and areas of loss. And then the next picture is that sheet repaired, and here you can see it's undergone. I've been able to surface clean it, which is removing all that dirt. I've been able to wash it, which again has helped remove the dirt and impurities within the paper and some of that water staining. You can see it's there, but it's not as significant. It's been humidified and pressed, and then the repairs again have been applied, again using that very light tissue. But I've used a different adhesive here. Here I've used gelatin, a cold gelatin mousse, and that's because of the inks. So as a conservator, what you're doing when you're assessing your documents, you're both looking at their physical damage, but you're also looking at how they're made and what they're made from. And all those components are taken into consideration when we're devising conservation treatments. This is another one, again, from the ports. These are very small little vellum receipts. You can see them. You can see how the fire damaged them along one side. You can see they crisp up. We nickname them slightly like pompadons because it's that effect. The skin, because parchment is animal skin, obviously the skin reacts to fire in a very different way to paper. And so it shrinks, it shrivels, and it kind of crunches up. And then again, using very similar techniques by introducing humidification in a very controlled way, that gets the animal skin more supple and more flexible, so you can start to kind of manipulate and move it. Then we've developed a technique, or sort of used it on a really regular basis. It's being used widely in other archives around Europe and the world, which is using magnets as a way to hold the dampened vellum in place while it dries. And this is what you see me doing here. I'm just placing with blotting paper and just magnets on top of it. It's on top of a metal sheet, which is why we can do it. And then what happens, and the results that you can see are just absolutely fabulous. Here we've got the full sheet. It's the receipt. The distortions have been removed from it. You can see it. We know there's ink there. That ink has unfortunately faded due to both the water and the mold damage. But there was ink. You can see where these were printed receipts, and then more details were described and written in manuscript. Another example, and this really probably is one of the current sets of material that we're working on, 1766 census. Again, these are just fabulous sort of records in terms of the content. But these are survivors from the fire. Again, these were probably identified by staff earlier than our 2017 survey project, but they definitely come in and are a highly valuable source. And these are being prepared at the minute for digitization. So what do we do with the stuff that's a little bit more tricky? And so here we have an example of a large vellum roll and parchment roll. You can see how, if you can imagine, if you can just see the layers of different sheets of parchment that are there. You can see where perhaps there's a substance that has kind of dripped onto the top and kind of welded them together. They're very sort of solid in the center, and then as it fans out, there's a bit more flexibility. And so this is where we're beginning to explore, and this is a very exciting stage for us, where we're beginning to explore the conservation of material like this. So this is where we look beyond the doors of conservation and the conservation room, and we look towards the conservation scientists and the other techniques that are out there within the cultural heritage profession. We've got a thing called X-ray tomography, which is basically like a CT scanner, but on a smaller scale. And we've got a thing called multispectral imaging, and then we've got micro X-ray fluorescence. And I've got some slides following now. So the X-ray microtomography. So this is a lovely example of a part of one of those rolls. It's a fragment from the center. You can see it quite clearly, and you can see where the loss is. We actually have the top part as well, but this is a central part. For this little solid bundle, a couple of the sheets at the top were pretty flexible, and I was able to remove those with conservation techniques, and I've conserved those using the methods of humidification and magnets to get them flat. But when it came to here, you can see in the lower picture where it's really it's blocked together, and it's very much solid. And so this is where we're hoping to work with some computer scientists based in the UK in terms of getting this scanned in a way that will hopefully give us an image that will be able to break down through the layers and see what's underneath each of these. Now, we know it's only going to be fragmentary. We know it's not going to be the full document, but as a method to see if the method works with one of our collections, we're very excited and hoping that that's going to progress in the next few months. Again, it's to do with the materials and the metals, but that'll just give you an idea of one of the things that we're exploring. Another thing that we're hoping to explore, you heard me mention, was a thing called multispectral imaging. And multispectral imaging is whereby you're looking at a document in different wavelengths. And this is a great example. This is one of the large rolls that actually was conserved by the office in the 1970s. And if you think back 1970s, well, that's 50 years ago. So they were looking at the 50th anniversary of the destruction of the Public Record Office. And the staff at the time identified this roll in particular. It was sent to London for conservation, which is a whole other amazing, fascinating story. And that's a whole separate lecture on its own. But what they did at the time was they knew that if they photographed it under UV light, it might be able to reveal text that we can't see with the naked eye. And that's exactly what these two photographs are showing you. Unfortunately, though, we know actually, once they got that far, it wasn't clear enough for them to actually transcribe. So now we're hoping with contemporary conservation techniques and cultural heritage practice, using a thing called multispectral imaging, where you photograph the document in 3 different wavelengths of light and then can merge them. We're hoping that this is something we will be able to get more clarity on. And so our next challenge as well is also then, what do we do with the rolls? Because all the work that you've seen me explain that we're doing in conservation is very much to do with single sheets or sheets that I can separate out and make into single sheets. And that's hugely successful, but actually we need to start tackling something like this, which is a roll of approximately 35 sheets of text. You can see there's some level of flexibility there, but in the core, it's quite solid. And so again, by doing a quite extensive research and talking to other colleagues, both in Ireland and internationally, we're looking at a different way to introduce moisture to that document and maintain it. And so hopefully try and introduce moisture to make it more flexible, and then do some of our drying techniques. And that is where I'm going to stop talking. And I'm going to pass over to Peter Crooks.
Thanks, Zoe. Thanks for that. And thanks to Elizabeth and everyone at the National Archives for this invitation to speak to you this evening. And thanks to you all for coming. I think over 100 participants, I can see it's just amazing. So it's wonderful. So if Ciarán was talking about life and Zoe was talking about death, and that gives me the awesome responsibility of talking about rebirth. And what I want to do is pick up the story from where Zoe has brought it into the 20th century towards the full-scale challenge of virtual reconstruction, which is the primary work of Beyond 2022 and our international collaborators. I'm going to bring you back first to the period after the blaze and the report that both Ciarán and Zoe have talked about. It's the 55th Deputy Keeper's Annual Report. It's a very dull title, but I think it stands as one of the truly remarkable documents associated with the life and death of the Record Office. It was published in 1928 by James Morrissey, who was then the successor to Herbert Wood, who Ciarán talked about. He was now the man in charge. And in a series of appendices in that report, Morrissey describes the effect of the fire on the building, the structure of the building, the effect on the Treasury, but also the immediate attempts they were making, as Zoe has suggested, for the salvage records to mitigate the disaster, to recover from devastating loss, and to look, and I think this is the really important thing, if you think about the 1920s and post 1922 in Ireland, they were looking across the Irish Sea in particular to repositories who held collections that were really significant in terms of the effort to reconstruct. And all of that is in the spirit of what we have been picking up 100 years later. In a sense, the 55th Deputy Keeper's Report is a blueprint for the method of information management that we're now bringing into the 21st century and the digital space. I'm going to quote from it now in a passage, and I'm also going to try and share my screen. I hope that's sharing with you now. In the report, there's a passage which describes the effect of the heat of the flames. Now, what you're looking at on screen is a virtual model of the same photograph that Ciarán Wallace showed you earlier in the talk. So you'll recognize that section there as the front office. This is the main entrance. That was the isolation space, the fire break that Ciarán discussed. And this long arcade of windows is the light-filled Record Treasury. And this quote refers to the effect of the fire on the Record Treasury. Morrissey writes, the Public Record Office consisted of two parts, the Record House at the front and the Record Treasury, appearing to constitute one block, but separated by an open area. That's that area there, across which was a covered bridge closed by iron doors at each side, which formed the principal means of communication between the two edifices. After the fire, according to this, the Record Treasury, the destruction was all but complete. The fire left little but tangled ironwork, blocks of masonry, mason rubbish, and the charred fragments of what had once been public records. So hold that harrowing image in your mind, if you will. And I'm going to share with you now a preview of our virtual reconstruction. It'll take a second to load. On the right-hand side, you can see the tangled ironwork that I just described. But in a minute, what will open up on the screen is the virtual model of the Treasury, split on its axis and sort of fanned out. So we can now see it as a virtual model in the way that Ciarán Wallace showed you. They used to imagine it in the Victorian era as a schematic printed in the Deputy Keeper's reports, onto which they would record what records have been placed. And in a sense, what we can begin to do now, this has been a dream of ours for a very long time, is take records such as the Yeomanry Returns that Zoe just talked to us about and place them back into the compartment where they belonged. This model is now live. You can look at this on our website and start exploring it. We put a selection of treasures from the Record Treasury back into their spaces in the virtual building. Where you see a green tile, that means there's something exciting for you to go and explore. But just so you locate yourselves, this is the entranceway, and this is the vertical space here. There are 6 floors above the ground level. I'm now going to go to the 5th floor. And when you do this, the model will swoop you in to the bay. You can see that we've recorded what was held in bay 5. That's level 5, compartment E, or bay E. That's the 5th compartment across from the building. We've recorded the contents of the bay. And when you click further inside, it will bring you to some information about the particular treasure that we've placed inside the bay, and it'll invite you to explore the document. Now, what's really significant about this is that this is not in any sense hard-coded into the model. This is being served dynamically from our database. So behind this whole experience is an enormous amount of computer science, wizardry, and technical expertise. And I want to pay credit now to the extraordinary work of the computer scientists and the technical architects who've helped us build this model. This is the Yeomanry Returns that Zoë Reid just talked about, presented now through a very sophisticated imaging standard that lets you zoom in on the records. You can see the burn marks and the charring of the records, but you can also read very clearly the handwritten list of members of the Yeomanry. This is for County Carlow in 1798. This is not my period, so if Ciarán Wallace felt like...
Sorry, I can't resist, Peter, excuse me. Sorry, we were so excited when we came across these records amongst the solved records. So this is literally the day-to-day sort of, you're a yeoman, you're a volunteer, turning out with the Redcoats to help suppress the United Irish Rebellion, and you turn up each day and you tick off the number of days of work you've done, and there on the screen is how many days pay is owed to this trumpeter or this drummer or this private, and then these are sort of sent off to Dublin. So they're, on the face of it, quite boring tax records, but actually when you drill down to what they tell us about, these happen to be County Carlow, these records, I think they're all County Carlow, the ones we have.
This one is all Carlow, yeah. Yeah,
but it's you know, if you flick through to any of the other ones, Peter, if you go through one or two more, you can see, I think it's in this one here, if you zoom in on that, sorry folks, we haven't rehearsed this is just us showing what we do on our desktop. If you look at the surnames there, you'll see that there's a sort of good mix of surnames. You've got sort of Coonies and Corcorans, along with Bishops and Kavanaghs. So it's not all just what you think of being classically English type surnames, but there's lots of local native Irish surnames who are joining the Redcoats to help suppress the Irish Rebellion. So it's really giving us a nice bit of complication on the sort of popular memory of 1798. Sorry, Peter, I'm sorry for interrupting.
No, why did you interrupt? You're saving me. It should have been introduced as a medievalist at the start of the talk, so people know that if I'm talking about post-medieval stuff, I'm chancing my arm just a little bit. But in terms of the technology, one of the things that we're bringing to these records and beyond 2022 is a degree of search and potential discoverability that they didn't have in 1922. So of course we've lost so much and we're trying to recover, but from those materials that we are able to bring into this system, we have much more capacity to search because we have developed systems for transcribing automatically the handwriting in documents such as this. This is experimental, it's ongoing research, but it's improving all the time. And I think the power it's going to give us over many of these manuscript collections is going to be very exciting. I'm going to close this record down now, if I can step out of it, and return to the Record Treasury. So this probably is a bit disorienting as I move around the building because I'm doing it for you, but here we are on the 5th floor, and imagine walking around those galleries that Ciarán described as looking a bit like Kilmainham Jail, everybody always says. And so you're now on the opposite side from where you were a minute ago, but still on the 5th floor. And we're going to Bay 5O. And in Bay 5O were held the records of the pre-Union, the pre-1800 Houses of Parliament in Ireland. Very rich record collection. It's one that was noted in the Deputy Keeper's reports. In particular, they said, you know, don't worry too much in effect because the Lords and Commons journals have been printed. So there's a copy of those records, although in fact we're finding very interesting materials that supplement that. But they regretted the loss of, quote, original volumes with their unrivaled bindings, whose loss must be deeply regretted. So what were these original bindings? If you visited the Record Office before 1922 and were given a tour, these were one of the treasures that they would almost certainly have taken out and displayed for you because they were famous at the time for their opulence. And by a wonderful parallel coincidence, a man called Philip Maddock, in the years as we were beginning this project, had developed physical reconstructions of the leather bindings of these House of Commons and House of Lords journals that were destroyed in 1922. And he did so in a way that these are physical objects, but his method replicates for the physical artifact what we're trying to do for the text that has been destroyed throughout the archive. So what you're looking at now is his reconstruction of the absolutely magnificent leather bindings for one of the journals of the 18th century House of Parliament in Ireland. But he created this by going back to his sources, as it were. Rubbings had been taken of the leather bindings in the Public Record Office before these were destroyed, obviously, was it in the 1890s, I think?
Actually, 1890s, 1904, that kind of period, yeah. Yeah.
And so we have the rubbings and we have also some photography, and we've placed these together in a sequence so you can see sort of how it can move from a pre-1922 photograph. That black and white photograph is extremely high res, but it is in fact an old photograph compared to his physical recreation, which he used his specialism to create the tooling that was required to
Philip is a radiation oncologist, so he works with these sort of medical grade scanning equipment. So he's able to use it to retrofit, to create the little brass tools and implements by just merely reading the bumps and hollows in the photographs and in the brass rubbings. It's a spectacular piece of work.
So what I love about this is, in a sense, we're bringing not just the documentary history of the Record Office to life, but also the things that they were themselves proud of in terms of their artifacts and the wider material culture of the office. And in that vein, when you went there, and we know they did tours, they were into public outreach and talks of this kind even a century ago, they would often have to answer the question, well, what is the oldest thing in the building? Well, we know that the oldest things actually weren't royal records. The royal records start in the early 13th century and run from the 1200s onwards, but they were church records. The Christchurch Cathedral collection was deposited with the Public Record Office. It was held one floor down the stairs, one floor, and along in 4R. And we're going to just go visit this one very quickly now. And the deeds from Christchurch Cathedral are the most important of these collections, and they were important to the living institution of the Record Office that Ciarán was trying to bring to life for us in the earlier part of this talk. In the same Deputy Keeper's reports, they published a series of annual reports that calendared the deeds from Christchurch Cathedral which numbered several thousand. But also, I think this is completely fascinating. At some point before the fire, the Royal Society of Antiquaries had a number of the oldest deeds of all imaged. So we would think about digitization. This is the 130 years ago, what's the equivalent to digitization? They would take photographs and have them preserved on glass lantern slides. And the Society of Antiquaries have shared these slides with us. So what you're looking at in something like this is an image created about 130 years ago of a charter that dates from almost the earliest point of administrative or constitutional connection between Ireland and England, the 1170s, created by Henry II, a grant of the first king to claim dominion over Ireland. And here it is preserved so that, I mean, for those of us who are interested as medievalists, the paleographical features, the physical attributes of the document are also available for study, as well as the text that was reconstructed in the calendars of the Deputy Keepers reports. So I'm stressing these things to show the range and the quality of sources that can be used in the reconstruction effort. I'm going to go to one last one, and then I'm going to have some concluding remarks. This one, I just bring to your attention to echo the point that Zoe was making, that we are following in the footsteps and often following in the footnotes of many scholars who've gone before us across the last 50 and 100 years. And one of those is Phil Connolly, who I'll be talking about a little bit more detail. One of Phil Connolly's great pieces of scholarship, she worked in the National Archives for several decades, was an edition of exchequer materials that go back to the Middle Ages. And you can see Public Record Office stamped on this document here. But that is the stamp of the Public Record Office in the UK, the Record Office now in Kew that began life on Chancery Lane. And they have many hundreds of these medieval documents that were transcribed back in the Middle Ages when they were already into bureaucracy and copying things out in duplicate and triplicate. And the original materials had been lost from their Irish office, but their parallel series survived in the UK, and Phil Connolly created a calendar of this and published it with one of our partners, the Irish Manuscripts Commission. And this is one of those books that I always have. It's literally here on my desk, but I'm so lazy now that I'll be more inclined to open up the digital version and see how it interlinks with the wider collections of the Public Record Office in this format in the future. So I'll stop sharing there. I have a few more remarks to make before I close, if that's okay in terms of time, Elizabeth.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, okay, thanks. I just wanted to dwell on this point that we're making about the fact that any active reconstruction, such as the one that we're engaged in now towards the centenary, is part of a much longer process of care and curation. We have this title that we put that comes from Herbert Wood of Malignant Destiny, and Wood talks about the damage that seemed to pursue Ireland's public records for centuries. He talks about fire and flame and carelessness and pilfering. But there is also a counter narrative, and it's one that he is very closely involved in. It's a counter narrative of careful, quiet, patient, persistent scholarship, ensuring that knowledge is preserved and shared. It's a history of curation and conservation, of advocacy, of listing, of indexing, calendaring, that's summarizing the contents of material, and ultimately publishing. And the heroes of this counter-narrative rarely make the headlines in the way that a dramatic fire in 1304 or 1711 or 1922 makes the headlines. But they are extremely important. The archetype of this heroic story is the anonymous archival cataloguer, because when disaster strikes, it is to the catalogues that we return to pick up the pieces. And this is precisely the story of the Beyond 2022 project and the century of scholarship that lies behind us. You can think behind 2022, it takes us right the way back to the very first conservators that Zoe's talking about, who picked up materials from the ashes of the Civil War. I wanted to pick up on two scholars in particular who are closely associated with the National Archives Ireland and the Public Record Office, but who I think also exemplify in their work during the 20th century the astonishing resources of patience and time and care and collaboration that we hope to emulate now. The choice is partly personal. They both happen to be medievalists. They both happen to have a Trinity connection. And so they exemplify that collaboration between historical researchers and the record custodians that I think is so important. But they both also happen to be women. And even in the mid-20th century and even later, this is a very male-dominated profession. So I think this is an important development too that's worth thinking about. The first one is Margaret Griffith. Margaret Griffith was Deputy Keeper of the Public Records Office. So that's the institution that survives and has an existence after 1922 and is one of the institutions that becomes the National Archives Ireland. She was Deputy Keeper from 1956 to 1971. She was actually the first person to hold that title since Herbert Wood in 1922. She was born in Galway and only died as recently as 2001. So she was 11 when the fire of 1922 happened. She went on to study 15th century Ireland at Oxford. She taught at Trinity into the 1930s, and she became one of the very few professional staff working in the Public Record Office of Ireland as it was in the 1940s. Now, more than any other scholar, Margaret Griffith is really quite remarkable because she was working in such isolation. She understood the importance of the 19th century collections, in particular of the Irish Record Commission, who Ciarán talked about at the beginning, and tried to explain the value of those older surveys and digests and calendars and indexes, things that were tended to be neglected or disregarded because they weren't original materials. And she tried to bring them to public attention. And she brought them, a number of them to publication stage with the Irish Manuscripts Commission. So that's the first of them, Margaret Griffith, who held the same office as Herbert Wood. The other scholar I wanted to pick up on is Phil Connolly, who I mentioned already. Phil would be 74, I think, if she were alive today, but she died tragically at an early stage in 2002, really at the prime of her professional life. It is a source of personal regret for me that I missed, probably by months, the opportunity to meet and work with Phil. I was just finishing my undergraduate degree in 2002, and I have a very clear memory of walking into the Department of History in Trinity at the time. I'm a very boring person. I was in Trinity as an undergraduate. I'm still there now. But there was a sign on the door noting the passing of Phil Connolly, and the department was closed as a mark of respect. In the year she died, 2002, she produced 2 publications that every Irish medievalist considers indispensable. One was Medieval Record Sources, which Zoë Reid will know I literally always carry with me when I go to visit her, this one here. And the other was an edition of the statutes of the Irish Parliament from the last years of the Yorkists, Richard III, into the early Tudors, including the only full transcription of a complete parchment statute roll to survive the blaze of 1922. So one of those salved records that Zoe's talking about, already identified by her scholarship. But that was really a summative moment in a remarkable career. The published output of Phil during 31 years, first in the State Paper Office, then the Public Record Office, and then the National Archives Ireland, was really remarkable. She was an exceptional paleographer. She understood the documentary riches of the medieval collections in NAI. In that sense, she picked up from Margaret Griffiths, but like Margaret Griffiths, she also had a huge range and was aware already of the value of things like the 1766 census returns that Zoe has just referred to. Time and again, when Ciarán and I think that we found out something new, or have had a new idea, or are working with Zoe on a new seam of evidence, we discovered that Phil, in some form, either published or unpublished, had already had a similar idea. And at the time of Phil's death in 2002, we know that what she was working on was a reconstruction of one series of records, the medieval plea rolls that Zoe showed in her pictures, a few fragmentary parchments from, as well as a tantalizing full roll, the magnificent KB13, which survived the blaze. I think, Zoe, that probably is the roll that's described in the 55th Deputy Kiwis Report as having been blown out of Bay 3D, compartment 3D on the 3rd floor of the Record Office, and landing in a heap of rubble. And they only managed to pick it up in October that year. By that time, it was covered with the weather damage that you refer to. But Phil was trying to reunite those original records with the materials that the Public Record Office Ireland itself was in the process of creating at the time of the fire. They were creating these calendars of the plea rolls. 2 volumes had been published before the fire happened. A 3rd volume had reached proof stage by the time of the fire and was finally brought to publication by none other than Margaret Griffith, who I was talking about a moment ago. The final volume in the set has almost never seen the light of day. Very few scholars have used it, but a sheaf of handwritten pages from the reign of Edward II, the plea rolls of the reign of Edward II, so early 14th century, survived in the working files of the Public Record Office. And when we look at the handwriting and the documentary record behind it, it turns out that the person creating that calendar, this is the type of thing that sends a shiver down my spine, was Herbert Wood. Herbert Wood was another medievalist, and this was his medieval project, in addition to becoming more and more senior in the ranks of the Record Office. So we have this survival. Now, that malignant destiny quote that we began with was Herbert Wood, and later in the passage he says in a wonderfully prophetic couple of sentences, he writes, "If the roots of the present lie in the past," remember he's writing within a month of the fire, "if the roots of the present lie in the past, the attempt to recreate that past is not only laudable, it is an imperative necessity. But how can it be done when the very material which is used for this purpose is consigned to the flames or carelessly allowed to perish?" Well, fortunately, that sheaf of papers, which he left in his office in 1922, has not been allowed to perish. They are currently being digitized by the National Archives for release next year through beyond 2022. But they were also being transcribed by Philomena Connolly in the late 1990s. And we have that electronic file. Over 250,000 words of searchable structured text has been made available through that source, reunited with Herbert Wood's transcription, and will be included in the Beyond 2022 database. That's just one case. Think about that, from the early 14th century, of an injection of 250,000 new words of content. And it shows also how in this one case, and it's representative of a much wider set of resources that we'll be making available, with a few hops across the last century, we can pick up the unfinished work of the last century and breathe new life into it for the centenary moment. So returning to that title, Malignant Destiny, Ciarán added a question mark, maybe even an optimistic question mark. I think it's time to think beyond malignant destiny and think about the living and positive and dynamic legacy that we hope collaboratively will bring together for the centenary. And it will be our collective responsibility to make sure that that legacy lives on for the century after 2022. Thanks very much indeed.
Peter, thank you very, very much, and welcome back, Ciarán and Zoe. If you could switch on your mics there, folks, please, for the Q&A. You'll be delighted to know that the Q&A box, bar about 2 questions, is filled with praise for an absolutely wonderful lecture. It really was fantastic. Certainly everybody has been full of praise. We've had people join from New York and from lots of other parts of the world. So there's a couple of questions I might just, amidst all the praiseworthy compliments and so on. There's a question here about what documents, records were moved to PROI and when. Specifically, were there any Dun Laoghaire records moved to PROI, or were there duplicate records kept in London? If any of you would like to answer that.
I'll jump on that one, if I may, Elizabeth.
Sure.
So the timing of the destruction of the office happened at the time when the Northern Ireland state had just been set up. So there was a move to, like the beginnings of a move to move records. So you can imagine, for instance, teacher registration is one I know I've read about, where teachers are registered by county. So you had to have a registration that you were a teacher in County Donegal or County Down. So if you suddenly were going to be on the other side of the border as a teacher, your registration papers had to be moved from the archives. That sort of historical paper had to be moved to the new Northern Record Treasury. But they hadn't got set up yet, and they were talking about these and arranging to shift records north. In some cases, some civil servants in some departments in Dublin were saying, we're not doing it, we're holding on to our records. Others just said, yeah, splitting the records is what we're meant to do. But the destruction came so suddenly then that there was very little had been shifted up north. The Donegal records is an interesting case because Donegal state records always and continue to be moved to Dublin. So taking 6 county was 6 county, the 9 county Ulster, the other 3 counties continue to send their records to Dublin. But certainly with when the PROI Public Record Office in Northern Ireland was set up, it began to collect records from within its own borders and beyond its own borders of things like family estate papers, family wills, genealogies, those sort of things. So there would have been a lot of landed families who felt greater, say, affinity or kinship with New Belfast government, and they might have agreed to donate their private papers, now not state papers, private papers, to Belfast. So Belfast began to sort of repair some of the absences from 1922 with private papers quite rapidly. But Donegal, any surviving Donegal state papers would have either stayed in Donegal or come to Dublin after 1922. So they shouldn't have been, or if they were there in Dublin from before 22, alas, they went up in smoke.
Peter, Zoe, anything to add to Ciarán's comprehensive response?
I don't think so. I mean, no.
I presume he planted that question in advance to show off.
a lucky hit, I assure.
Certainly for particular records in the National Archives that are organised spatially, such as census returns, tithe allotment books, and so on, the 6 counties of Northern Ireland, the tithe allotment books did go north to PROI. As far as I know, they didn't split the education records because it simply would have been too difficult. But certainly for discrete items like volumes of the tithe allotment books, it was relatively easier to separate those and to send them north. But obviously, as Ciarán was saying, it was slightly different for some of the medieval records. The Q&A box is filling up, folks. The next question is, yes, regarding the parallel records at Kew, can you quantify how much Kew has shared? Now that's anybody
Peter,
take that question?
Peter, I think, yeah.
Peter?
Yeah. So to understand the process, there's 2 things happening in parallel. There's a piece of work that's trying to complete, in a sense, what was begun by Phil Connolly. Phil created a edition, the one I showed, that's now one of the treasures in the Doll's House, that we call that, sorry, that's that 3D experience. They were the records of what's called the medieval issue rolls. That's payments from the Irish Exchequer going out, payments made for office holders or anything else like that. So the entire run of records that she calendared in English has been digitized and will be interlinked with her translation. But in parallel with that, there are also the records of monies coming into the medieval Irish Exchequer. Those have also been digitized, and we are creating a new English language calendar to run in parallel to Phil Connolly's one, which will be available digitally next summer. And in terms of quantity, I mean, it's hundreds of rolls of parchment. It's very, very significant in terms of the medieval content. I said there's different bits of the work because another part of our collaboration with TNA is less about doing mass digitization at this point. It's about using TNA as a base to discover what's in both its collections and wider British archival institutions and repositories, which may be suitable for further development and digitization. So there's a colleague called Dr. Neil Johnson. He happens to be a Dubliner who's based in TNA, and he is our co-investigator leading that work with our researcher who's based at TNA. And they are identifying materials, not just in TNA, but also in the British Library, in the Bodleian, and the Cambridge University Library, and other places across Britain where we are doing some digitization now within this phase to release those materials for next summer, but also trying to assess, well, what is the, where's the real material to do a project at scale in the future, and to understand what's involved in that, and so on. I hope that gives some sense of the nature of the work.
Thank you very much for that, Peter, for such a comprehensive response. There's a question here, moving forward, how do you link with the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, and is there a plan to bring both archives together post-1922?
Well, we are at work together. I mean, I think this is the thing that we actually hear, and we always used to say, but we probably have forgotten to say
it.
Yeah,
we didn't.
Let's say it again.
Yes.
Which is that, you know, the Public Record Office that Ciarán was talking about from 1867 is a sister institution or a sibling institution to the Public Record Office that's founded at Chancery Lane in 1838.
In London.
The London Record Office is the first one. 30 years later, thereabouts, we get one in Dublin. And in 1923 to 4, the Public Record Office in Belfast is created post-partition. So these are three very, very closely related, we always say they're genetically linked institutions who collaborated in some senses. You know, the Public Record Office Northern Ireland Director has always been a member of the Irish Manuscripts Commission, for instance, as is Director of the National Archives, and before that, the Dublin Record Office. But there was never a formal common enterprise or project until beyond 2022, on which all those three institutions had a common vested interest. So that, in phase 1 of the project, which was 2016 to 18, that was the really exciting potential collaboration, which we are now beginning to realize in this phase of the project. So it's not a question of institutional merging, that's not what's going to happen, but there is an awful lot of goodwill and sharing of data and information and digitization, and the potential for cross-linking these very, very closely related materials. And particularly when we're into PROI post-1600 materials directly related to the very rich state paper collections in London and similar materials in the Chief Secretary's office in Dublin. I think it's very, very exciting.
And just to add to that, that the directors in Dublin, London and Belfast all sit on our advisory panel. So they have both at a coalface working archivist level, and then at a top level executive level, they're directly involved in what we're doing. So there's a huge sort of goodwill, but also commitment to share this kind of shared endeavour thing. So it's very exciting for us and very positive.
Thank you all there. We have a lady tuning in from Wyandotte in Michigan saying, beautifully done, so encouraging to my volunteer efforts as a transcriber. So thank you, Sandy, from Michigan. We have a request or question rather from a person who's asking, I was wondering what documents would you be expecting to find from the remains of the destruction of the records or the reading room? Is there one type that has shown up more than others or more frequently? And is there a reason why?
No, I suppose in terms of materials, I would sort of say there are more parchment records have survived, obviously, and you'd expect that than paper records. So I think that's primarily what we're seeing, as opposed rather than a specific sort of series as such. There are bits and pieces. Obviously, one of the largest things that we're not dealing with as part of this project, but that did survive were a collection known as the Chancery Pleadings, and they were an extensive collection of vellum, parchment, and Peter knows exactly. I've done the conservation work on them. There are lots of them with a colleague, and that was a very successful project over a number of years in the National Archives, predating beyond 2022, and that's probably the largest. I always said that was the largest collection from my knowledge, and I think we're kind of right that in that sense. And the Chancery Pleadings, Peter, date really from the 15th and 16th.
16th was Tudor, late Tudor onwards.
Okay. And there are about 5,000, 6,000 of them,
or even more. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think they're a very exciting vein of original material.
Yeah.
To be followed up.
Yeah.
I think though, when you think why do things survive, there's the durability of parchment, which is you know, the great surprise is how the old media are better than cheap paper. But I think so much of it is chance. You know, just which bit of the office, you know, as the building starts to cave in, does it happen to land in, and so on. So we know there are deed boxes that were in the basement for the Landed Estates courts for which materials survive also, because they were protected from the worst of the
And then we're also trying to figure out, I can see where some of there are text blocks which are kind of in the process of being repaired and sewn by that lady sewer, perhaps, that Ciarán was mentioning. In a room there was a book repair room in the record house, and so we can see stuff, and I'm looking at it going, it's just ready to be sewn and stitched together. So they've taken documents and they've done repair on them with the technique and a method that they were using at the time, which was really common in the early 20th century. Yeah.
So maybe that's another thing to say for that questioner. If materials were in the front of the building, which we keep saying survives, and many were, then this is the reason why they're in good condition now, as you're saying.
We think so, yeah.
And sometimes they were in use. Was it Good Friday?
They were closed on Good Friday, but Holy Thursday afternoon. So if you were a researcher, it still is the case today. If you order up records on a Friday and you say, right, I'll be back on Monday, I promise, and the archivist might say, I'll keep it in the strong room over the weekend, so turn it out, so I can hand it straight back to you on Monday morning. But there was no Monday morning in this case. So stuff that was in operation, in use on the Thursday before the occupation was put in the strong room waiting for after Easter weekend. But Easter weekend became the long occupation, became the destruction on the 30th of June. So stuff in the strong room actually survived. That was held out for readers to return, but they never returned.
And then the Record Commission materials that Ciarán talked about and Ms. Griffiths was so interested in, they were treated in the pre-1922 period as sort of working files that were guides to the originals in the repository. So they were in the reading room or the record office and were consulted for as a index or a way into the materials. And so they survive in bulk. That's the reason they survive in bulk, but often with amazing shrapnel damage. And I have this great letter from two English historians who came to Ireland quite early to look at these. I'd say this would be just post-war, and they were staying in the Gresham Hotel on O'Connell Street and walking down every morning to the forecourts to do their work. But they were probably among the first to look at those Record Commission volumes, and they described still finding the bits of the shrapnel in the paper.
Really? Cool. Excellent.
I'm just conscious of time here and how generous you have been with it. So just perhaps one or two final questions. There's a question here as to whether material that would have been in the public record office, have you ever encountered it coming up for sale at auction? And is there a precedent for buying or bidding for it and reclaiming it on behalf of the Irish state? If any of you would, Zoe?
I suppose I can comment on that in terms of not perhaps recently, but it did happen in the 1960s. And if you go through the Deputy Keeper's reports as well, you will see that material was purchased when the office was trying to reconstitute its collections. Not recently, but I know there are examples of material that was purchased in the late 1960s, 1968, and Sotheby's. Other than that, I can't really say.
The distinction between, so what I haven't seen happen, I haven't seen happen is something that was sort of blown out of the building and it lands somewhere in Dublin and it ends up in auction later on. I haven't seen that, but there were things that, in a sense, archivally belonged with what was in the record office, but at some point in history, for whatever reason, let's not say they were stolen, but they weren't returned. They had got separated from whatever office they were in Dublin Castle or whatever, and they do end up in different collections. And some of those were purchased in the 60s, as you say, Zoe, by the record office, in a very far-thinking, forward-thinking approach.
Yes,
I mean, but even before that, in the 30s, when you would think resources would be limited for this type of thing, they were actively purchasing not original materials, but transcriptions from, say, the Phillips collection. Manuscripts of Beetham and other 19th century antiquarians were being actively pursued and brought in to replace. So that's what I mean when we say we're standing on a century of scholarship behind beyond 2022.
Absolutely.
It's, we're only, in a sense, now as we come towards the centenary, beginning to understand the richness of all that. And it'll be, our job to present not only a defined thing for the centenary, but also the wealth of materials that remains to be fully understood and included.
I think it's fair to say that all your presentations, the joint presentation, has really brought home the immense debt that we owe to the men and women of the Public Record Office staff, who must have been heartbroken going through the rubble, and yet they still had enough poise and composure and courage to go in and to parcel up and to save as much as they could. And your emphasis, or your shining a light on the members of staff through those wonderful Mills albums and the photographs of the searchers. And I'm sure there were plenty of women who were also involved in salvaging material. They really have been the unsung heroes of this whole, in many ways, tragic episode. But also how right you are in terms of placing an emphasis on optimism. Yes, we understand it was a catastrophic loss in 1922, but the work that this project has done, I think it's fair to say, has been unparalleled in terms of its scope, its ambition, its vision. It's bringing people and records out into the spotlight that was, I suppose, neglected or denied them for so long. And one very quick question that I have, and I've always been meaning to ask this, is there a parallel for this project in any other part of the world? Has any other archive or library tried this or undertaken such an ambitious and creative project?
Yeah, I mean, there are parallels, but maybe not with the virtual space. I mean, there are digital libraries, but not necessarily trying to recreate something that didn't exist. There have been analog attempts to recreate libraries that were destroyed. So we got different things, but the bringing together of those two things maybe is something that I'm proud of. I think we can all be proud of, and I think the collaboration is really wonderful in bringing forward the examples of the analog versions. The famous one is Naples, 1943, when the State Archive of Naples is destroyed as the Allies are moving up through the boot of Italy, and the records are taken out, and it's very well documented how they were deliberately destroyed by fire outside Naples. And the archivist who witnessed it happen, Filangieri, engaged in a long attempt to collect copies from multiple sources and publish the registers again that had been destroyed. But that, in a way, it was the State Archives of Naples. It was incredibly extensive for the Middle Ages and so on, but it wasn't sort of all parts of national history throughout a very long stretch of a country's experience. So the range of historical material that we're trying to bring together, I think probably is unprecedented.
And the computer science aspect of it as well. I think that linking of computer science, archival expertise, historical expertise coming together, and that sort of collaborative endeavor, I think that is, unprecedented. I think that's, sorry, it sounds a bit boastful to say it, but I think it's true.
Well, no, because early on people would say that, basically you're mad, but it's a good idea. We just have to strike the balance between madness and the potential there, I think.
Well,
I think the framework is, the exciting thing that we're developing.
That was a very generous tribute, Peter, that you paid to Dr. Phil Connolly, whose 20th anniversary will be coming up next year.
In June next year.
Yeah. You certainly were standing on the shoulders of that. Everybody was standing on the shoulders and the knowledge of the giant that was, in terms of her breadth of knowledge, her expertise, her willingness to share it. She was a medievalist, an author, a lecturer, and sometimes the word polymath is often bandied about, but she really was. She was a true polymath in her grasp of so many different disciplines. You probably know, I think, did she go back to college and do a music degree as well? And
well, I didn't know that, but I knew she was very interested in music and opera.
Yeah, in addition to being a great aficionado for detective novels and crime, the gorier the better. But again, that was
it may have been why she liked the medieval plea roll so much, because plenty of crime and gore.
She wrote a wonderful piece on the medieval plea rolls for one of the ISA journals in maybe the mid to late 90s, and she focuses on people having their eyes kind of popped out by fights and brawls, and she certainly focused on the bloodthirsty angle of. And
if I may, just one thing that I didn't say earlier. I mean, what she said about the potential of those records has still never been fully realized in terms of their capacity, even the early materials, to reveal social historical detail about ordinary people in everyday life in Ireland, even though these are quote unquote dry administrative records. She had that skill to bring out that story. And I think that's something that we'll want to try and emulate too.
Oh, very, very much so. I think her doctorate was Lionel of Clarence in Ireland, which became Lionel and Clarence in Ireland, which conjures up this wonderful notion of Lionel and Clarence going on some medieval road trip in Ireland in the 14th and 15th centuries. But I'd like to thank, on behalf of the many people who tuned in really from all around the world, thank you so very, very much. That was a riveting, absolutely fascinating talk that is very much reflected in the comments that appeared in the Q&A box, and if I were to read them all out, we'd still be here at midnight. So but just to give you a flavor very much of just how much people enjoyed it. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise to people. If we didn't get around to answering your questions, very sorry about that. I'd also would just like to say very briefly that our next online lecture will take place on Thursday, the 31st of August, and will focus on researching Church of Ireland ancestors. So they'll have a hard act to follow, so do keep an eye on our Twitter account for further information and booking details. We will be saving the date for that in early August. But in the meantime, míle buíochas reach the Gachduine agus go háirithe to our speakers tonight. Thank you very, very much. Enjoy your evening and slán go fóill. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. Goodbye.
Thanks, Liz. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.